The music drowns out the sound of the street outside. From the balcony of a modest apartment on Rue Verdun in West Beirut, the city looks almost calm. The sea breeze moves the thin curtains, carrying in the distant echo of traffic and the muffled thud of artillery from the hills, like a storm that never quite arrives. Inside, a young woman stands perfectly still, framed in the dim light. She holds a sketchbook in her hands, one page half filled with an unfinished drawing of the street below. On the table beside her lies a set of colored pencils, a chipped porcelain cup with cold coffee, and a small, heavy device the size of a cigarette case. She has rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks. She knows that the man she has hunted without ever meeting will enter her field of vision in less than a minute. She knows his habits, his fears, his weaknesses, the way he leans back in the car seat, the way his security convoy boxes him in. She also knows that when she presses a single button, there will be no second chance. Below, the sound of engines grows louder. Two vehicles, a Chevrolet station wagon in front, a white Chevrolet Suburban behind it. The convoy moves in formation, just as it has every day. The woman lays the sketchbook gently on the table and steps closer to the balcony door, careful not to disturb the cat sleeping on the chair. On the wall, a calendar shows the date, January 22nd, 1979. The man in the back of the Suburban is Ali Hassan Salameh, the most wanted Palestinian operative of his time. To some, he is a charismatic revolutionary and the son of a martyr. To others, he is the architect of terror, the man whose name is whispered in the corridors of Western intelligence services whenever someone says one word: Munich. The convoy slows as it approaches the parked red Volkswagen Passat. From above, the car looks ordinary, forgotten, just another piece of metal on a crowded Beirut street. Only a handful of people on the planet know that inside its body, hidden in its frame and trunk, rests a carefully constructed bomb, wired to an electronic receiver and packed with roughly 100 kilograms of explosives. The woman's finger hovers over the switch. Her heartbeat is steady, but a single thought cuts through the noise in her mind. If she misjudges the distance by even a few meters, she will kill not only the target, but everyone around him. She has spent 117 days living as someone else, mapping every routine, every angle, every possible variable. Now all of that compresses into a single decision that will last less than 1 second. The Suburban is now almost directly alongside the Volkswagen. In the back seat, Salameh leans forward, speaking to the driver. On the sidewalk, bystanders walk past, unaware that their lives are about to intersect with one of the most secretive assassination campaigns in modern history. In a safe house across the city, other operatives wait for a coded call that will tell them if 8 years of pursuit are over, or if the ghost of Munich has slipped away again. On Rue Verdun, the woman exhales slowly. Her thumb presses the switch. A white flash erupts from the street. The Volkswagen disintegrates in a brutal wave of fire and pressure. The shock wave smashes windows up and down the block, hurling glass into the air like shrapnel. The Suburban is lifted off the ground, its metal frame crushed and twisted as if it were made of paper. Smoke and dust swallow the scene as screams tear through the afternoon calm. In the chaos, the woman does not move. She watches the fire climb, hears the alarms begin to wail, feels the building shudder around her. Then she steps back from the balcony, closes the door, and reaches for a small suitcase already packed by the bed. In less than an hour, she will vanish from Beirut as if she had never been there. This is the story of how Mossad spent months infiltrating war-torn Beirut, built a perfect illusion around a British woman with a cat and a sketchbook, and used a single parked car to eliminate the man they believed had orchestrated the Munich Olympics massacre. This is the story of how Mossad killed Ali Hassan Salameh. If you want more stories about real covert operations, high-stakes intelligence, and the hidden wars fought in the shadows, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next episode. To understand why an entire intelligence service devoted years of effort, enormous resources, and some of its best operatives to one man, you have to step back from that burning street in Beirut and return to a different city, under a different kind of spotlight. Munich, 1972. Ali Hassan Salameh was not just another member of a militant organization. He was widely regarded as a key operational brain behind Black September, the group that carried out the massacre of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games. To Israeli leaders, his name became synonymous with a single night that shattered the illusion that sport and politics could ever be kept apart. In the early hours of September 5, 1972, 8 members of Black September climbed the fence of the Olympic Village in Munich, armed with assault rifles and grenades. Their target was the Israeli team. By the time the crisis ended, 11 Israeli athletes and coaches were dead, along with a German police officer and several of the attackers. The world watched the drama unfold live on television, unaware that the decisions made in those hours would echo through decades of covert warfare. Within Israel, the attack created a wound that was both personal and political. Many of the dead were young men who had survived earlier wars, only to be killed in a place that was supposed to symbolize peace and unity. For the government in Jerusalem, the message was brutal. Their enemies could strike Israelis anywhere, even on what was supposed to be neutral ground. In the weeks that followed, Israeli intelligence and political leaders decided on a response that would become one of the most controversial and secretive campaigns in modern history. The objective was clear: identify and eliminate those responsible for planning, supporting, and directing the Munich operation. In that hunt, Ali Hassan Salameh emerged as one of the most important targets. He was often described as the Red Prince, a nickname that reflected both his political lineage and his lifestyle. He was the son of Hassan Salameh, a prominent Palestinian commander killed in the 1948 war. Growing up in the shadow of that legacy, Ali inherited not only a cause, but a reputation he would spend his life living up to. By the early 1970s, he had become a central figure in Fatah's intelligence and security apparatus, and a leading figure within Black September. Intelligence assessments from that period describe him as a man who played a critical role in planning and coordinating operations abroad, using contacts in Europe and the Middle East to move people, weapons, and money. To Western journalists, he sometimes appeared as a polished, almost glamorous figure. To his enemies, he was the polished face of terror. For Mossad, Salameh represented something even more dangerous than a single operation. He was a man who understood both the arms struggle on the ground and the media battlefield in the West. He moved between Beirut nightclubs and diplomatic salons, between safe houses and embassies, building relationships not just with guerrilla fighters, but also with foreign intelligence officers and politicians. That made him harder to isolate and harder to kill. There was also a deeper concern. Various accounts suggest that Salameh developed channels of communication with the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, offering a degree of protection for some American interests in Beirut in exchange for tolerance toward his own movements. For Israel, the idea that one of the men tied to Munich could be cultivating ties with a key ally was intolerable. Every time Israel's intelligence community reviewed the list of those connected to Munich, his name was near the top. But turning a name into a body required more than anger or political will. It required intelligence, patience, and the willingness to operate in one of the most dangerous cities in the world. By the mid-1970s, Salameh headed Force 17, the elite personal security and commando unit tasked with protecting Yasser Arafat and senior PLO officials. That position gave him access, power, and a small army of loyal fighters. It also made him even more difficult to reach. Every street he drove along, every building he entered, was scouted and secured. He moved in convoys, changed routes, and surrounded himself with layers of guards who understood that their own survival depended on his. But even an organization accustomed to operating in hostile capitals understood that this target would not fall easily. Mossad had already paid a heavy price for its post-Munich campaign. In 1973, in the Norwegian town of Lillehammer, a team sent to eliminate Salameh shot and killed an innocent Moroccan waiter, Ahmed Bouchiki, after misidentifying him as the Red Prince. Several operatives were arrested, and the scandal exposed methods, networks, and diplomatic relationships that Israel had hoped to keep in the shadows. The Lillehammer failure did more than embarrass Mossad. It created a psychological scar. The man they had tried and failed to kill now moved through the world knowing that an entire intelligence service had already reached for him once and missed. After that, every attempt to track him carried not only physical risk, but the weight of past failure. For Mossad and for the Israeli leadership that had authorized the campaign, the mistaken killing in Lillehammer turned the hunt for Ali Hassan Salameh into something else, a matter of unfinished business. Years later, as the red Volkswagen sat waiting on Rue Verdun, the bomb wired and armed, that unfinished business was about to end. In the quiet conference rooms where Mossad planned its most sensitive operations, The hunt for Ali Hassan Salameh was no longer a vague ambition. It was a concrete task pinned to walls, spread across maps, and written into classified files. The question was no longer if he should be eliminated, but how it could be done without repeating the disasters of the past. The starting point was always the same: intelligence. Before anyone forged a passport, rented an apartment, or booked a ticket, analysts and field officers gathered every scrap of information they could find. They built a picture of Salameh's life in Beirut, piece by piece, like a puzzle scattered across continents. Reports from assets inside Lebanon described his movements, his security routines, his preferred restaurants, the homes he visited, the people he trusted. Intercepted communications, surveillance photographs, and human sources all fed into a growing dossier. Over time, a pattern emerged. For all his caution, Salameh lived a life of influence and visibility. He moved through the city in convoys. He attended meetings and social gatherings. He did not hide in a bunker. That visibility was both a strength and a weakness. It made him harder to ambush in a quiet alley, but easier to track. Within Mossad, debates formed around methods. Some argued for a close-range shooting, the kind of operation that could, in theory, minimize collateral damage and offer near certainty that the target had been hit. But such an attack in West Beirut, close to PLO strongholds, and amid a dense security environment, risked turning into a firefight that the team might not survive. Others proposed bombing his convoy in a more controlled way. A carefully placed explosive device, detonated at the exact moment his car passed, could concentrate the blast on the target and give the operatives physical distance from the killing itself. It would be harder to execute, but easier to escape from. The second option slowly gained ground. It matched hard lessons learned from previous missions. Distance, a pre-positioned device, and careful timing could offer a combination of lethality and deniability. The remaining challenge was enormous: to position that device on a street that Salameh used often enough to justify the risk, and to place someone nearby who could observe his convoy and trigger the explosion at the perfect moment. That requirement led planners to a single, unavoidable conclusion. To kill him, they would have to live with him, not inside his home or his office, but inside his city, on his streets, in his daily shadow. The next stage of planning focused on cover. Any operation in Beirut at that time had to account for multiple intersecting dangers. Palestinian security, Lebanese militias, rival intelligence services, and ordinary criminals all watched the city in overlapping circles of suspicion. Foreigners were noticed, patterns were recorded. A wrong word at a checkpoint could unravel months of preparation. The solution was to construct identities that made sense in that environment. Europeans, especially those with plausible humanitarian, journalistic, or business backgrounds, could move through parts of Beirut with fewer questions than others. A woman living alone with a quiet, artistic cover story might easily be dismissed as harmless. So the outlines of the operation began to crystallize. A small team would enter Beirut under carefully crafted identities. One of them would be a woman whose life story, on paper, explained why she would rent an apartment overlooking a key route, stay there for months, and appear to have no reason to care about the movements of a Palestinian security chief. The choice of that woman was critical. She would need not only the technical skills to handle a detonator and communicate securely, but also the psychological resilience to live an entirely false life in an enemy stronghold. She would be alone for most of the time, with no visible backup, no obvious support. Her only companions would be her cover, her routines, and the knowledge of what she was there to do. Once the broad concept was approved, the logistics machine moved into motion. False passports were prepared, drawing on years of experience in creating identities that could survive scrutiny at airports and border crossings. Background stories were constructed for each operative: places of birth, fields of work, reasons for traveling to a country at war. Some identities were built on the skeleton of real, obscure lives. Others were entirely invented, but backed by supporting details that could withstand casual verification. Parallel to this, another crucial task unfolded: targeting the streets. Analysts sifted through reports of Salameh's movements, diagramming the roads he used from his home to his office, from his office to meeting points, from those points to social visits. These were overlaid onto city maps. Choke points were identified. Narrow stretches where his convoy had limited options, where traffic forced vehicles to slow, where a parked car would not look out of place. Among these, one area drew particular attention: Rue Verdun, a busy street in West Beirut lined with apartments, shops, and parked cars. It was a route that offered both the cover of ordinary life and the opportunity to hide in plain sight. It was also close to locations that Salameh visited regularly. From there, a specific scenario began to form. If an operative could rent an apartment on that street, on an upper floor with a clear line of sight, they could monitor the daily flow of traffic and confirm Salameh's patterns firsthand. A car, properly prepared and parked along his likely path, could be turned into a trap that he would drive into not once, but every time he passed. The risk, of course, was time. The longer the team stayed, the more chances there were for something to go wrong. A neighbor's curiosity, an unexpected visit from local authorities, a random checkpoint. But without time, there could be no certainty. The operation needed patience as much as it needed explosives. As planning intensified, the woman chosen to serve as the on-site observer and triggerman took on the identity of a quiet, self-contained European living abroad. Her legend presented her as someone who had reasons to disappear into a foreign city for a while. Personal upheaval, a need for solitude, a vague artistic or humanitarian project. Nothing too specific, nothing that would encourage close questioning. Her cover tools were simple and believable. Sketchbooks, drawing materials, perhaps the presence of a cat, to explain why she rarely left for long periods. Books in the apartment, a routine of short walks, local shopping, polite but distant interactions with neighbors. To anyone looking casually, she would be unremarkable, almost invisible. Behind this carefully constructed ordinariness, a second existence took shape. Hidden communication equipment, coded messages, prearranged signals, regular check-ins with support operatives elsewhere in the city, who themselves moved under different identities. Business travelers, aid workers, journalists. Any meeting between them had to be justified by their covers, or arranged in ways that left no obvious trace. The bomb itself was a separate project, handled with equal care. Specialists designed an explosive device that could be concealed within the structure of a car without drawing attention from a casual inspection. Wires, detonators, and the explosive material were configured to maximize the blast in a specific direction, toward the road, toward the point where a convoy would be passing, toward the position that the target's vehicle would most likely occupy. A key decision was made. The device would be detonated remotely, using a signal that the woman in the apartment could send the instant she judged the conditions to be right. That meant that she would have to recognize Salameh's convoy reliably, distinguish it from similar cars, and account for distances, angles, and the presence of bystanders in a fraction of a second. Training for that role did not happen in front of a sunny window in Beirut. Before deployment, she would have spent long hours rehearsing identification drills, decision-making under stress, and technical handling of the trigger mechanism. She would have practiced watching moving vehicles through binoculars or from elevated positions, learning how to judge speed and distance, how to predict where a car would be in the next heartbeat, not just where it was now. When the plan was finally judged ready, approvals were granted through the necessary political and organizational channels. It was understood that this would be a high-risk operation in a highly sensitive environment. It was also understood that failure was not a theoretical possibility, but a real danger, with consequences not only for the operatives, but for Israel's diplomatic standing and for the broader regional balance. Then, as always, the theory met reality. One by one, the operatives made their way toward Beirut, carrying their covers around them like second skins. At airports and border points, they presented passports, answered routine questions, and passed into a city at war without revealing, even through a flicker of expression, the true reason for their arrival. The woman who would become the quiet resident of Rue Verdun arrived as just another foreigner in a place that had grown accustomed to seeing outsiders come and go. She rented her apartment, moved in her few belongings, and began to construct the rhythms of her false life. Early on, every knock on the door, every unfamiliar noise in the stairwell, was a test of her composure. In the first days and weeks, the priority was observation, not action. From her balcony and windows, she watched the street at different hours, building an internal map of its sounds and movements. Which cars stayed parked for days, which ones came and went quickly, where pedestrians gathered, how the light fell at different times of day. She noted police presence, militia activity, sudden roadblocks. All of this would matter when the time came. Away from Rue Verdun, other members of the team conducted their own surveillance. They tracked Salameh's convoys, photographing vehicles, drivers, and bodyguards where possible. They documented the routes he favored, the timings he kept, the adjustments his security made in response to visible risks. These streams of information flowed back into a coordinated picture that the woman in the apartment could use to refine her expectations. Gradually, patterns emerged. There were days when the convoy took one route, and days when it took another. There were minor variations, delays, sudden changes, but over time, certain habits reasserted themselves. Human beings, even those trained in security, often return to what feels familiar and efficient. Those habits are what intelligence services live on. The car that would become the bomb entered the picture quietly. Obtained, prepared, and positioned with care, it took its place among other vehicles lining the curb. There was nothing in its appearance to betray its true nature. To neighbors, it was just another car that someone had parked, and perhaps forgotten for a while. To the woman watching from above, it was a coiled weapon waiting to be triggered. Then came January. Among the routine movements and predictable patterns, one piece of information gained particular significance: a family occasion. Salameh was expected to travel to visit his mother for her birthday. That visit, and the route associated with it, added another degree of predictability to an already familiar pattern. On the morning of January 22, 1979, Beirut woke to another day in a long war. People went to work, militia fighters checked their weapons, diplomats reviewed their cables, shopkeepers opened their doors. On Rue Verdun, a red Volkswagen sat motionless at the curb. In a nearby apartment, a woman stood by the window, a sketchbook on the table behind her, and waited for the moment when months of planning would compress into a flash of light and a roar that would shake an entire street. The convoy appeared first as a distant vibration in the city's background noise. On Rue Verdun, the afternoon light was pale and flat. Cars crowded the street, their bumpers almost kissing. A taxi driver leaned on his horn, shouting at no one in particular. A young man on a scooter wove recklessly between lanes, a sack of bread swinging from his handlebars. In the apartment above, the woman with the sketchbook stood a little back from the window. The curtains were drawn just enough to break the outline of her silhouette, but not enough to obstruct her view. Her hands rested lightly on the table, near the device that would decide whether this would be just another noisy Beirut afternoon or something else entirely. She had woken early that day. It was not fear that pulled her from sleep, but a sense of tightening focus. The pattern of the last weeks had pointed to this day, this visit, this route. She moved through her morning deliberately. Coffee, a few pages in the sketchbook, a short walk to buy bread. She greeted the shopkeeper across the street with the same soft nod she had used a dozen times before. Nothing in her movements suggested that she was counting down the hours to an explosion. Back inside, she checked the line of sight again, though she already knew it by heart. From her window, she could see the stretch of Rue Verdun where the red Volkswagen waited. Parked in a row among other vehicles, it drew no attention. Dust had settled on the hood. Someone had brushed past it earlier and left a faint smear on the driver's side door. It looked like a car that belonged to no one in particular. She ran through her mental checklist. Recognition. Confirm the lead car. Confirm the Suburban. Confirm the position of the target. Distance. Wait for the convoy to draw level with the Volkswagen. Not before, not after. Bystanders. Scan the sidewalk. Judge whether there was a momentary thinning of pedestrians. There would never be an empty street. Not here, not now. But there might be a margin. On Rue Verdun, the air thickened with the sound of engines arriving from a distance. The woman shifted her weight, moving closer to the device on the table. Then she saw them. The convoy emerged from behind a slow-moving truck, the familiar Chevrolet station wagon in front, the white Chevrolet Suburban behind. The vehicles moved in tight formation, close enough that anyone trying to cut between them would feel the pressure of an unseen threat. Her breathing slowed. She let her eyes pass over the lead car first, noting the driver, the position of the passenger, the angle at which it entered the street. The station wagon drew closer, its engine noise blending with the surrounding traffic. It rolled past the red Volkswagen, the gap between them closing and then opening in a matter of seconds. Her focus shifted to the Suburban. Even at this distance, she knew the outline of the man in the back. She had studied photographs, grainy surveillance images, and sketches until his posture felt almost familiar. Now he was there, in the line of fire she had spent months preparing. The Suburban approached the Volkswagen, Traffic compressed around them, the natural slowing of a busy street. Her gaze flicked to the sidewalk. Two schoolboys walked close to the curb, jostling one another. A middle-aged man in a suit stood near a shop entrance, gesturing with a cigarette as he spoke to someone inside. It was not perfect. It would never be perfect. The street was alive, and life was rarely considerate of secret plans. The front of the Suburban came level with the Volkswagen. She counted an internal beat. 1. The grille aligned with the rear of the parked car. 2. The front wheel drew parallel to the Volkswagen's front door. 3. The approximate position of the rear passenger seat slid into the kill zone the engineers had modeled. Her hand closed over the device on the table. Outside, the sun glanced off the Suburban's windshield, creating a brief flare that hid the interior from her view. In that instant, she no longer saw faces or details, just geometry, vehicle, distance, blast radius. She pressed the switch. For a fraction of a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the street ripped open. The explosion was not a sharp crack, but a deep, tearing detonation that seemed to push the air out of the lungs of everyone within range. The red Volkswagen vanished in an expanding sphere of fire and metal. The Suburban was hurled sideways, its body folding, windows exploding outward in a spray of glass and shattered plastic. Windows up and down Rue Verdun burst in unison. Shards of glass erupted into rooms, slicing curtains, cutting into walls, dropping onto furniture. A shockwave rolled through the buildings, rippling plaster, knocking frames from walls, tipping cups from tables. People on the street were flung to the ground, their ears ringing, the world momentarily stripped of all sound except a high, thin whine. Then the noise rushed back, screams, car alarms, the anguished shouts of those who had been thrown into sudden pain. Flames licked at the twisted remains of the Suburban, dark smoke curling upward, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning fuel, rubber, and flesh. A tire rolled across the street by itself, spinning lazily before toppling over. In the apartment, the woman stood still. The building had shuddered beneath her feet, a brief sway that passed as quickly as it had arrived. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, illuminated by the light streaming through the now shattered glass of neighboring windows. Her own panes, shielded by angle and distance, had survived. The curtains still hung. She did not move closer to the balcony. She did not need to. The blast pattern she had been briefed on, the likely effect on a vehicle at that distance, the vulnerability of human bodies inside, it all played in her mind, merging with the image of the destroyed Suburban below. She made one final calculation. The probability that the man in the back seat had survived that blast was vanishingly small. Shouts rose from the street, calls for help, for ambulances, for someone to do something. Men ran toward the wreckage, some out of duty, some out of instinct, some out of curiosity. Others ran away, driven by the reflex to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the explosion. Within minutes, armed men began to appear, some in civilian clothes, some in recognizable uniforms. They pushed bystanders back, tried to establish a perimeter, shouted questions no one could yet answer. Was it a car bomb? A mortar? An airstrike? In a city under siege by its own contradictions, the list of possibilities was always long. Somewhere amid the chaos, someone realized who had been in the destroyed vehicle. The news began its own rapid journey outward, faster than any official report. First as rumor in the crowd, then as hurried calls from one faction's headquarters to another's, then as crackling radio messages. A name spread through the streets, through the refugee camps, through the offices of diplomats and intelligence officers. On Rue Verdun, the woman turned away from the window. Her part in the operation was finished. There was nothing she could do to influence the chaos below or the political storm that would follow. Her responsibility now was to disappear with the same calm deliberation she had shown when she arrived. The suitcase waited by the bed, packed not with documents or weapons, but with exactly the kind of possessions that fit her cover story. Clothes, notebooks, a few personal items that would look unremarkable if anyone ever searched the room after she left. She took a last look around the apartment. There was no trace of hidden equipment. Devices had been dismantled, components scattered or disguised as innocuous items. Minutes later, she stepped into the stairwell. Voices echoed from distant floors, people shouting in confusion, some crying, some trying to call relatives to confirm they were still alive. She descended with measured speed, neither rushing nor dawdling. Outside, she turned in the direction opposite from the crowd's main flow, blending into the stream of people moving away from the smoke. By the time the first investigative teams tried to piece together what had happened on Rue Verdun, she would be gone, slipping through the logistic channels that had brought her into Beirut, back into the quiet anonymity of an ordinary European life that had never really existed. In the hours after the explosion, hospitals in Beirut filled with the wounded. Doctors and nurses, already numb from years of war, scrambled to treat burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones. Among the casualties brought in from Rue Verdun were bystanders who had been unlucky enough to stand too close to the blast, as well as members of Salameh's security detail, whose bodies had been torn by metal and fire. The body of Ali Hassan Salameh himself did not remain anonymous for long. Within Palestinian circles, confirmation of his death spread quickly, accompanied by anger, disbelief, and a grim recognition that the man at the center of so many plots had finally been outmaneuvered. For some, he was a martyr, cut down by a relentless enemy. For others, he was a symbol of a particular era of armed struggle, whose death marked the end of a chapter. In Israel, the first word did not come as a public announcement. It filtered into secure rooms through intelligence channels, where duty officers and senior figures watched the incoming reports with disciplined skepticism. This time, the confirmation solidified. Witness accounts, photographic evidence, and internal Palestinian communications all pointed to the same conclusion. The man they called the Red Prince was gone. Inside the Mossad headquarters, the mood was complex. There was satisfaction, certainly, a sense of a promise kept, a long-standing mission brought to completion. But there was no open jubilation. Those who planned and executed the operation understood that the explosion on Rue Verdun had reverberated far beyond the immediate killing. There were civilian casualties. There would be political fallout. There would be questions from allies and accusations from enemies. In Washington, officials who had maintained quiet contacts with Salameh were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The man some had seen as a useful channel had been eliminated by an ally who saw him only as a terrorist mastermind. The divergence in perspectives was now written in blood on a Beirut street. In Beirut itself, the assassination deepened the sense that no one was truly safe. If a figure as heavily guarded and connected as Ali Hassan Salameh could be killed in the center of West Beirut, then every leader, every commander, every prominent face was a potential target. The message extended far beyond the PLO. For the Palestinian movement, the loss was both practical and symbolic. Practically, they had lost a man who had held key security and organizational roles. His absence created gaps that had to be filled quickly. Symbolically, the Red Prince had been a potent figure. Young, glamorous, defiant, able to move between gunmen in fatigues and guests in evening wear. His death deprived the movement of a particular kind of face it had shown to the world. For the operatives who had been in Beirut, the end of the operation did not bring a public reward. They slipped back into their ordinary covers, or into new ones, traveling under different names through airports and ports where no one celebrated them. The woman who had pressed the switch on Rue Verdun returned to a life where neighbors might know her only as the quiet foreigner who liked to draw. In the private confines of memory, however, the images could not be edited so easily. The pattern of the street, the glint of sunlight on the suburban's windshield, the sensation of the building shifting under the force of the blast, all of it remained sharp. In the still moments of later years, those seconds might play again behind closed eyes. On Rue Verdun, the physical scars of the explosion were repaired over time. Broken windows were replaced, damaged facades were patched. The wreckage was cleared away, the burned-out husks towed off, the blood washed from the asphalt. New cars parked where the red Volkswagen had once stood. New tenants moved into the apartment buildings, bringing their own stories and worries, unaware of the role those walls had played in a hidden war. For Mossad, as an institution, the operation became one more chapter in a complex narrative. It was cited as proof of persistence, of the ability to reach enemies in supposedly secure environments. It also served as a reminder of the thin line between surgical action and collateral damage, between strategic success and diplomatic complications. In the end, what remained was a set of intersecting truths. A man who had risen from the shadow of his father's death to become a central figure in a violent struggle was killed on a street in Beirut. An intelligence service, driven by the trauma of a massacre on Olympic soil, and scarred by earlier mistakes, spent years to ensure that moment arrived. A woman, whose real name might never be confirmed publicly, stood at a window with a small device in her hand and changed the course of several lives with a single movement of her thumb. History would debate the justice, the effectiveness, and the consequences of that act. Some would argue that it deterred future operations, that it sent a message necessary for national survival. Others would contend that each assassination sowed new seeds of anger, ensuring that the cycle of violence continued. But none of those debates could alter the simple, concrete fact of what had happened on Rue Verdun that day. A red Volkswagen waited by the curb. A white Suburban approached. A woman in an apartment watched, counted, and decided. Then the street exploded, and the Red Prince vanished into the smoke.